I read an interview with you, I think, or maybe I think it was an interview with you where you sort of whimsically commented about how you bullshitted your way into a job at
Yeah.
the Paris Review as a technology editor or something. How did you get mixed up with George Plimpton and the whole Paris Review crowd?
So I had been working, I don't remember if it was some environmental organization, and then I had gotten exposed to writing for the first time because I had studied physics and astrophysics and really saw my future, or the only possible future, or something that was related to the hard sciences. But particularly in those fields, they become so esoteric as you move up that, like, you know, it gets to a point where like 40 people on Earth know what you're talking about, and it's a fairly lonely existence. So I sought some sort of application of science that had, you know, more intercourse with the world. And it just kept letting me get exposed to other aspects of things. And then instead of pursuing hard science, I sort of started writing about science. And then I ended up having to write something. And this is a testament to my Dalton education, but like, I hadn't taken a writing class since 10th grade. And there I was 24 years old. And I was like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I really like this.
Yeah.
So the advice I'd gotten from a friend was just immerse yourself in the world. And I think by that she meant, you know, read as much as you can, go take a class, learn this. And, you know, huckster that I am, I was like, oh, I'm just going to fake my way into this.
Yeah.
So I had reached out to a couple of friends in publishing, and it turned out that the Paris Review was looking for somebody to sort of bring it into the 21st century.
What is this, late 90s, early 2000s?
This is 92, 3, something like that.
Yeah.
And
they didn't have the internet, was
yeah.
10 years later. There was no internet.
There was
early.
This was early. This was when people were like, can you tell me about the internet? And that was literally the line that I used on Plimpton when I got an audience with him. And I said, the future.
How did you, at a cocktail party?
No. They were looking for an editor who was computer savvy and all this kind of stuff.
Before the days of LinkedIn.
Yes. And I through a friend, God, it was probably Lizzie Gottlieb, somebody, I don't remember, got me the interview. And I just walked in and I literally handed him my resume, which probably had 7 spelling mistakes on it. And like, but all of my scientific publications as like work I've published.
Right.
And he was just kind of laughing. And I was like, the future of your magazine, Mr. Plimpton, is the internet.
Yeah.
And he went, good God, man, you're hired. And he hired me. And the truth was, like, where I was a scientist and I could use a computer, I didn't know what the internet was.
Right.
So I went out and hired somebody to do my job for me. And I just took my time there as like this unpaid internship. And I learned everything that I could.
So someone else was doing the internet aspect of this.
Yeah. A guy named Joe Mackin, who's a great guy. He's still around.
Well, you were just under the tutelage and mentorship of
great
George.
Editors there. Well, not just George. I mean, George was sort of very, very much upstairs in his ivory tower, but like the editors there were the smartest people I'd ever met in my life.
Who'd you work with?
A woman named Elizabeth Gaffney, who knew everything about everything. A great guy named Daniel Kunitz, who's like a brilliant editor. The sort of old hand at that time was a guy named James Linville, who I think still to this day, like, has read every book ever written. Like, these were really bright people who really cared about literature, who really cared about the future of little magazines, and the important role they served in finding unknown writers. And, you know, the Paris Review had pulled out of this, you know, the slush submissions like Rick Bass and all of these great writers.
I just read a short story. The legend of Pig Eye Reeves, the boxing one. I think that was in the Paris Review.
I don't remember, but the review, I mean, you know, the stuff that they have published and discovered is extraordinary. So these magazines that were running on fumes and goodwill and reputation,
hell of a trio. Fumes, goodwill, and reputation,
making absolutely no money, and were, you know, in perpetual peril. It felt like you were fighting the good fight. And I was there just to learn from these
observing.
People. And
sponge.
Yeah, and I learned a lot. I made a ton of stunning, like colossal blunders that to this day, like still I cringe. I'll walk down the street and just like go,
Probably
oh
should have
my
got you
God.
fired, but
There was, I mean, if not for the good graces of Elizabeth Gaffney, but there was like one of my first assignments was to copy edit something, and I don't remember. It was somebody's interview. Might have been like it's probably like Ted Hughes or something.
yeah.
And he referenced the Edmund Spenser poem "Fairy Queen," and there it is written in type Faerie, and I grab out my fucking red pen and circle, and I'm like, "That's not how you spell fairy." And these poor people had to pull me aside and be like, "Andy, like you don't know what you're doing." So there was a real like, load, shoot, aim kind of thing that I was doing. But I ended up being sort of a productive member of the community, and I did serve some purpose with, helping the technology aspect of it. And in the meantime, I became very close with George, and George took a liking to me, and I eventually admitted my, my con, and that I was an imposter, and he found it comically charming. And then,
of course he did.
Asked me to write
hilarious.
something, and then I wrote a short story, and he was like, good Lord, man, this is terrible. And then asked me to write something else, and it was in the first person. He was like, you actually write this very well. He was like, you should write about yourself.
Yeah.
In the same way that he does.
Yeah.
And then he said, what do you do? And I said, I don't know, I play poker. And he was like, and then he got me a gig writing an article for Esquire,
right,
to write about an underground poker club, and that turned into Poker Nation, and that was the beginning of my career.
It's interesting. Were the offices? It was run out of his apartment on Fifth Avenue. Right?
No, on 72nd in the East River, 541 East 72nd. It's the last building.
Did he live there as well?
He lived in the second and third floors, and the reviews offices were in the basement.
Right.
First floor and
underground basement or first floor?
It was first floor, so there was an office where the editors sat, and then there was a basement where all the interns and yo-yos like me sat. Yeah. And I actually had an office. Like I was the only one with an actual closed door office, and it was the meter room.
What made you so lucky?
Because it was like filled with asbestos and nobody else wanted it.
Oh,
like,
fair.
So,
or maybe a special office for the technology.
Yeah.
Specialist.
So that was my chair. But it was glorious. I mean, it was, that was the golden age.
Was it as lively and I wouldn't use the word disorganized, but I've seen the pictures, I guess, of people running around the office. It
was exactly as you picture. It was fairly disorganized, and it's funny because I did say like the magazine survived on goodwill, and the truth was like when we answered the phone there, we didn't say Paris Review, we answered the phone Plimpton office.
Yeah,
because two of the staff members who were paid by George as his personal assistants, but they were Paris Review editors. And, when we were fighting for a short story, Tina Brown would publish a John Updike, Updike's got a new short story, and Tina Brown calls and says, I'll pay you $25,000 for it. And then Plimpton has to call Updike and say, I'll pay you $100, but I'll throw you a hell of a party.
Yeah.
And that's how we survived. And everything was like, just like spitting gum wrappers, because George was the spokesman for McCallum. So all of our parties only had scotch.
Yeah.
Right. Like there really wasn't a bar. It was because George would get it, 6 cases of Macallan, and that's what we would serve.
Right.
So we were always broke, but it was just fighting the good fight. Right. I mean, there was no better way to learn the business by being like, your job, Andy, is to solicit advertising, edit copy, read the slush, take out the garbage. Like that was, it was the
all on the cards.
Yeah, it was just the best. It was just the best. And I'm, and it's embarrassing because other people were actually really good at the literary aspect, and I didn't know anything at the time, but, I've hope I've made amends. But
how did George get himself appointed as Fireworks Commissioner of New York? What was that about?
So I think that was largely an honorary title. It's funny, I can see his book right over there, Fireworks. George was absolutely he was fascinated by fireworks.
Oh, the fat man thing.
The chair and he turned into, not that he wasn't always, but like he turned into a child around fireworks.
Just like jumping up and down.
He couldn't control himself. He loved them so much.
Yeah.
And it was like my first week at the Paris Review, and most of the editors had gone off to some estate of some friend of Plimpton's in Lake Como. And
casually?
And they were doing something there. I don't remember what it was. And randomly over the lake, somebody started shooting fireworks. And the story goes, I wasn't there, but I think Kunitz told me the story that George, like after, 18 scotches and everybody's hammered, he hears this faint pops, and George knows these are fireworks. And he kind of looks up, and you see this sort of the lights flickering off the lake. And George apparently popped up in the middle of the night, dead of night on Lake Como, and just starts running towards fireworks because he can't control himself, and tripped over a lawn chair and this and that. And like my first meeting with George day one was when he came back from Lake Como. And it was like his arm was in a sling. His face was like, had scratches all over it, because he was such a child around fireworks that like his personal safety did not matter. Like if he could get to the fireworks before they stopped, he was going to get there. So George was, a bit of a celebrity, and I think somehow ingratiated himself with the Grucci family, who were the people who used to sponsor the fireworks. And
in New York?
In New York.
For what? For New Year's or something?
4th of July.
Yeah.
And George, being George, talked them into naming him fireworks commissioner of New York.
Interesting. Andy, final question here. Who is George Plimpton to you?
So my youngest son is named George, and George Ames Farish Bellin and George Ames Plimpton. I named my son after George because forget just the sort of literary prowess and the editing and writing 30-something books. George was, and I'm sure this is an antiquated term that's probably not appropriate to use, a Renaissance man, like a Renaissance person, however. He knew so much about so many things and cared so much about so many topics that he was inspirational on like 9 different levels, right? Just being around him, his breadth of knowledge, his concern for the earth, his ability to help other people. We would be walking through an airport, and some random dude would spot him and be like, oh man, you're George Plimpton. And this was not a guy that you were going to spend your day with. And George would say, would you like to come have a drink with us? And all of a sudden we're drinking with, Frank, who is a plumber in Queens, but read, Bogeyman, and it was the greatest thing ever. And so George was a mentor. He was inspirational. And it's funny, like I was only there a couple of years. Like a lot of guys knew George better than I did, but I loved him. He got a tremendous kick out of me. But there were all of these lessons to be learned just from observing him. It's like almost at a poker table where you're trying to figure out who's who. Like George, the way I write is very much an homage to George because he never took himself too seriously. Like there was not this, I know he's always sort of equated with the sort of gonzo journalists and stuff, but like he did not take himself seriously.
Yeah.
There's a great line in Shadowbox where he was like talking about his prowess as a fighter because he ended up fighting Archie Moore.
Yeah.
And he said, I was born with something called a sympathetic response, which means that whenever struck, I begin to cry. And it was just, that's who he was and how he lived his life. And I don't know, there was also the internship program at the Review was very important. The fact that George was such a caring person that he could never fire anybody.
Yeah.
So like, even when he found out I was an imposter, he promoted me. So I was like, he promoted me to a position that I couldn't do much damage, basically. But he couldn't bring himself to fire anybody.
Right.
So I feel like there were examples of how to live one's life that George either intentionally or unintentionally presented to all of us at the review, and some of it stuck. So I don't know. George was somebody who meant the world to me, shaped my life, whether he meant to or not, by giving me the opportunity to present myself as something I wasn't, but then challenged me to learn to become the thing that I had faked that I was.
Right.
And it was, it was the most definitive experience.
Yeah. Andy Bellin, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for coming, man. I appreciated it.